Today's remarks come from three experts. They will address the historic dimensions of changing the name of this county from Lane to Kalapuya. David Lewis is an anthropologist of Kalapuyan descent. He will talk about the original people of the Willamette Valley, describing what distinguished their culture and how they fared in the early years of contact and statehood.
Thanks for inviting me to speak on this issue. For me, I think the issues here are less about Lane himself, Joe Lane. I mean, I think, as Doug will say, he has a storied past. He's got some positives and negatives, and we'll hear that from Doug. It's more about, for me, the Kalapuya people themselves. The fact that they lived here for upwards of 16,000 years or more. There's many different bands and tribes of the Kalapuya that lived throughout the valley. They had a unique lifestyle where they accessed mostly roots and plants for food, did some fishing, did a lot of hunting. Camas was pretty much a staple of the tribe, and they actually accessed foods like wapato and huckleberries and other root plants, and they made a pretty amazing sort of lifeway here in the valley where they had spread out. They had traditions like building mounds in wetlands to get above the flood waters, the seasonal flood waters. They sort of learned to live with the environment around here, and there was so much food produced in this area they didn't need agriculture, so there was no agriculture here. At the time when the fur traders began coming into Oregon and the early settlers began settling the valley in the 1830s, the tribe was suddenly hit with, the tribes all in the valley and in the area were all hit with a massive disease, likely malaria, that destroyed 90 to 97% of some of the bands. So that if there had been 10 villages of a band, there was reduced down to one, and a very small remnant population of people remained. This left a lot of open area for settlement, and the early settlers saw this, wrote stories about it. In fact, Jason Lee, really famous Methodist in the valley, went back on a tour of the East Coast and attracted more settlers to the valley, which is very successful, probably started the Oregon Trail itself. And so those people that came, first in the hundreds, then the thousands, began taking land and putting all this land under an agricultural philosophy, agricultural regime. They began putting in farms, fences, plowing fields, plowing up the food sources of the tribes, and the Camas was plowed under and destroyed in exchange for crops, things like wheat and oats and things like that. And so the Kalapuyans began to starve. They began to go for want of food, and they were being pushed away from their territories, original territories, by essentially the settlers who came in increasing numbers. And so eventually, by the 1850s, the tribes got to the point where all of the land in the valley was taken. They had to sort of subsist as they basically could on the edge of farmers' lands on the goodwill of settlers, and eventually were forced onto reservations because they became known as vagrants and thieves. They were trying to steal food that the settlers were not giving them at all, because the farmers were taking all the land, all the products and all the resources. So this is what happened to the tribes, and I've documented this pretty well for Oregon. The southern Willamette Valley, for whatever reason, that we don't have a lot of information about. Apparently settlement was very fast here. I think one of the first settlers, Jacob Spores, actually settled on top of a native village. His property was right there, and on his property there was a native village and a cemetery that was documented later on. Essentially the tribes are pushed out of the land. And none of that in the first, up to 1855, was done even under U.S. law legally. There have been no treaties that have been signed and ratified by Congress. The tribes still, under U.S. law, owned their aboriginal right to the land. And so that all happened essentially by the press of people moving to Oregon, to this area, to the Willamette Valley, to find more wealth, and taking the wealth and resources from the tribes. And so today, the Kalapuya people mainly are associated with a couple reservations, Grand Ronde and Siletz, that we're moved to. We were forced to stay in the reservations in a very poor situation for more than 100 years. Now we are reassociated with those restored reservations in the modern era. And most of us have no long-term wealth. No Native people that I know have 100-year farms. They just don't have them because they were not allowed to own land. So we are looking at a situation where people were divested of all of their land, divested of all their resources, forced to be put on reservations illegally, and were basically forced to move by the Army, and had to remain there as non-citizens of the United States until at least 1924. So to me it sounds like internship, it sounds like a prison camp, and so today it seems like something should be done. And I think that we hear this happening in society. People want to do land acknowledgements, which is a way of acknowledging the fact that Kalapuya peoples and other peoples were here. But a lot of people are saying that's not enough. That doesn't really do anything helpful. Maybe if we were to make a grander stand and say this was originally a Kalapuya place for at least 16,000 years, let's make it a Kalapuya County again, because there were a lot of Kalapuya tribes here, the Chelamela, Chamafen, the Winfili peoples, the Yoncalla peoples. They were all in this place and utilized the resources of what's now Lane County. And so I think that is important. We are doing this on other place names. We're trying to replace, lots of sort of racist and sexist place names around Oregon and the nation, replacing them with native names or the original native names sometimes of those places. Like recently I worked on a project for renaming Swastika Mountain, and we're going to try and rename it, Halo Mountain, after a chief of the Kalapuya tribe. So these are important things, to bring back the place names that actually lived here sometimes for 16,000 years. Everything was renamed away from our peoples, taken away from our peoples. So let's bring some of that stuff back. And that's kind of what I've been doing for a long time, and I think a lot of people, they have a sensibility towards that.